You have been given an answer to a question you never got to ask. The answer arrived early. It came through school, through science documentaries, through the quiet assumption underneath every conversation about death you have ever had. The answer is this: when the brain stops, you stop. Consciousness is what the brain does, and when the brain is gone, there is nothing left to do it. Nobody announced this to you. It was simply present in the way certain things are present before you are old enough to question them. By the time you were old enough, it felt less like a belief and more like a fact. The kind of fact that doesn't require defending because nobody disputes it. Except one person did. In 1896, a French philosopher named Henri Bergson published a book called Matter and Memory. In it, he built a case, methodical, precise, grounded in the neuroscience available to him at the time, that the brain does not produce consciousness, that the relationship between mind and brain is not the relationship between a flame and its light. It is the relationship between a signal and the instrument receiving it. Damage the instrument, and the signal seems to disappear. But the signal was never inside the instrument to begin with. This is not a metaphor dressed up as philosophy. It is a logical argument. And it has a logical consequence that Bergson stated plainly and that most people never encounter in their lives. If consciousness is not produced by the brain, then the destruction of the brain cannot destroy consciousness. You cannot actually die, not as comfort, not as religion, as a conclusion that follows from the evidence. William James, the man who founded American psychology, who held the chair at Harvard, who wrote the textbook that defined the field for a generation, read Bergson's argument and called it the most important philosophical contribution of his time. Then James spent the last decade of his life investigating whether the evidence supported the conclusion. He believed it did. Neither of them is taught anymore. This is not an audiobook about death. It is an audiobook about an argument, one of the most consequential arguments ever made, that was followed to its conclusion by two of the most rigorous minds of the 20th century, and then quietly set aside by a field that had already decided the answer. You were given that answer before you could question it. Here is the question. Chapter 1. What everyone assumes and why. Start with what you already believe, not what you were told to believe, not what you absorbed from a textbook or a lecture. What you actually feel to be true when you stand at a graveside, or sit in a hospital room, or lie awake at 3 a.m, turning the question over in the dark. When the body stops, the person is gone. Not relocated, not transformed, gone. The light goes out. Whatever was happening inside that particular arrangement of matter, the thoughts, the memories, the experience of being someone, stops happening, because it was always just the brain doing what brains do, and the brain has stopped. This is not a cynical position. It is not even a cold one. Most people who hold it are not trying to be bleak. They are trying to be honest. They have looked at the evidence and followed it where it leads, and this is where it leads. Consciousness is a physical process. Physical processes end. That is the whole of it. And the evidence on the surface is overwhelming. Consider what happens to the mind when the brain is altered. Anesthesia doesn't dim your awareness, it erases it. One moment you are counting backward from 10, and the next moment there is nothing. And then there is a recovery room. Not darkness, not dreams. Nothing. The most sophisticated mind in the known universe. Yours. Switched off completely, because a chemical changed the activity of neurons. If consciousness were something other than brain activity, why would a chemical have that effect? Consider what happens with alcohol. 2 drinks, and your judgment softens. 5 drinks, and your memory begins to fail. Enough, and you are functionally someone else, a person who says things the sober version of you would not say, who feels things differently, who cannot access the parts of your personality you consider most essentially yourself. The brain changes and the self changes with it. They move together perfectly. Consider the stroke patient who loses language. Not the ability to speak, the ability to think in words. A blood vessel closes in a specific region of the brain, and an entire dimension of human experience vanishes. Consider the Alzheimer's patient who can no longer recognize their own children. The person is biologically alive. The brain is still functioning. But something that seemed essential, the self, the continuity of experience, has gone, damaged by a physical process in a physical organ. The evidence points in one direction. Brain and mind are not two things. They are one thing described two ways. Damage the brain and you damage the mind. Destroy the brain and you destroy the mind. This is what the evidence shows. This is the fortress Henry Bergson walked into in 1896. He did not walk in carrying a different set of values. He did not walk in hoping for a different conclusion. He walked in as a philosopher, trained in the same empirical tradition as everyone else, carrying the same evidence everyone else was looking at. And he asked a question that should have been obvious, but that almost nobody had thought to ask. He asked, what exactly is the brain doing? Not what the brain is correlated with. Not what changes when the brain changes. What is the mechanism? What is the actual process by which neurons firing produces the experience of being aware of anything at all? And here the fortress, which looked so solid from the outside, developed its first crack, because nobody knew. The correlation was undeniable. Alter the brain, alter the mind. But correlation is not a mechanism. Two things moving together do not tell you which one is causing the other, or whether both are being caused by something else entirely. This is not a subtle philosophical point. It is the first thing taught in any serious course on scientific reasoning. Correlation does not establish causation. A radio receiver and a radio broadcast move together with perfect fidelity. Damage the receiver, and the broadcast seems to degrade. Destroy the receiver, and the broadcast seems to vanish entirely. If you had never encountered the concept of radio transmission, if the receiver were the only thing you could observe, you might conclude, reasonably, that the broadcast was being produced inside the receiver, that the receiver was the source. You would be wrong. But your evidence would not be wrong. Your interpretation of the evidence would be wrong. Bergson looked at the brain and asked whether neuroscience had made the same mistake, whether the perfect correlation between brain states and mental states was being interpreted correctly, whether the brain might be doing something other than producing consciousness, something that would look identical from the outside, that would produce all the same correlations, but that would carry a completely different implication for what happens when the brain stops. He thought it was. He thought he could show it. And in matter and memory he did. But before the argument could land, Bergson needed to find the place where the production model failed, not where it was merely incomplete, where it produced a prediction that the evidence flatly contradicted. He found it in memory, and memory is where everything begins to come apart. Chapter 2. The Man Who Asked the Wrong Question. Memory should be simple. If the brain produces the mind the way an engine produces motion, then memory should work the way any physical storage system works. You encode an experience, a face, a name, a moment, into neural tissue. The tissue holds it. You retrieve it when needed. Damage the tissue, and you lose what was stored there. The more tissue you damage, the more you lose. The relationship should be direct, proportional, and mechanical. This is what the production model predicts. This is not what Bergson found. In the 1890s, Bergson immersed himself in the clinical literature on memory disorders, not philosophy texts, medical case studies, patients with brain lesions, stroke damage, and progressive neurological disease. He was looking for the proportional relationship the production model required. He did not find it. What he found instead was stranger and more difficult to explain. Patients with severe damage to specific brain regions would lose the ability to retrieve certain categories of memory. Not randomly, not proportionally, but in patterns that did not map cleanly onto tissue destruction. More disturbing were the cases of spontaneous recovery. Patients who had lost access to memories, names, faces, events, entire periods of their lives, would sometimes recover them suddenly, without any corresponding recovery of brain tissue. The tissue remained damaged. The memory returned anyway. If the memory had been stored in the damaged tissue, this should have been impossible. You cannot retrieve what has been destroyed. And yet retrieval happened, which meant, Bergson concluded, that the memory had not been stored in the tissue that was damaged, which meant it had not been stored in the brain at all. This was not a comfortable conclusion. Bergson did not reach for it quickly. He spent years testing it against the evidence, looking for the alternative explanation that would preserve the production model. He did not find one that held. What he found instead was a distinction that would become the foundation of everything that followed. He proposed that the brain is not a storage organ. It is a retrieval mechanism. Its function with respect to memory is not to hold experience, but to access it, to reach into something larger than itself and pull forward what is useful for present action. The memories exist independently of the brain. The brain's job is to make them available when needed and to suppress the vast majority when they are not. This reframing had an immediate explanatory advantage. It accounted for the spontaneous recoveries. The memory had not been destroyed because it had never been in the damaged tissue. The tissue damage had disrupted the retrieval mechanism, the brain's ability to access the memory. When retrieval partially restored itself, the memory was there, intact, waiting. It also accounted for something everyone has experienced but rarely examined, the way a memory can arrive without being summoned. A smell that returns a moment from 20 years ago with a completeness and immediacy that deliberate recall could never achieve. A piece of music that restores not just a recollection, but the entire texture of a period of life, the emotional weather of it, the way time felt. The person you were. These memories were not retrieved by the brain. They arrived through it. There is a difference. Bergson had been led here not by philosophy, but by clinical data, and having arrived, he saw that the implications extended far beyond memory. If the brain is a retrieval mechanism rather than a storage system, if it reaches into something beyond itself rather than containing everything it accesses, then the same question applies to consciousness itself. Is the brain producing awareness, or is it doing something else? Something that looks like production from the outside, but is, mechanically, its opposite. This is the question that led Bergson to write Matter and Memory. Not as a book about memory, though it is that, as a book about what the brain is actually doing, and what that means for everything we assume about the relationship between mind and matter. Henry Bergson was 37 years old when he published it. He was already known in French philosophical circles, already considered one of the more precise and careful minds of his generation. He was not a provocateur. He was not trying to resurrect religion or smuggle the soul back into respectable discourse. He was following the evidence the way he had been trained to follow it. He had grown up inside the dominant philosophical tradition of his time, positivism, empiricism, the conviction that reality was material and measurable and that the task of philosophy was to get out of the way of science. He was not rebelling against this tradition. He was applying its own standards to a question it had assumed was already settled. The question was, what is the brain doing? The positivist answer was, producing consciousness. Bergson's answer, arrived at after years of examining the clinical evidence on memory, was, that is not what the data shows. What the data showed, what the patterns of damage and recovery, retrieval and failure, suppression and spontaneous restoration pointed toward, was a brain that functioned as an interface, not a source. An instrument that stood between consciousness and the physical world, selecting, narrowing, focusing, filtering, making available what was needed for survival in the present moment and suppressing everything else. Not generating the signal, receiving it. And if that is what the brain is, if its function is to narrow and focus rather than to produce, then the question of what happens when the brain stops is no longer the question everyone assumes it is. The question is not, what happens to the flame when you blow it out? The question is, what happens to the broadcast when the receiver is destroyed? Bergson had his answer. Chapter 3. The Filter. There is a moment in the history of an idea when it stops being a suggestion and becomes a proof. The suggestion is this: the brain does not produce consciousness. The proof is the argument that follows. And the argument begins not with a claim about death or the soul or anything that requires belief. It begins with a question about function. What is the brain for? Not philosophically, biologically. What problem does the brain solve for the organism that has one? The answer, from an evolutionary standpoint, is straightforward. The brain exists to keep you alive. Its job is to process the information available in the environment. Select what is relevant to survival, suppress what is not, and produce appropriate responses. It is, at its core, a selection mechanism, a filter between the organism and an overwhelming flood of potential experience. Consider what it is filtering. At this moment, your sensory apparatus is receiving an amount of information that no conscious mind could process. The precise pressure of the chair or floor beneath you, the temperature differential between every square centimeter of exposed skin, the full acoustic texture of every sound in your environment simultaneously. The complete visual field, including the periphery your attention is not directed toward, your body's interior, the rhythm of digestion, the tension in muscles you are not using, the low electrical hum of every organ doing its work. You are not experiencing any of this. You are experiencing a narrow selection of it. The parts your brain has determined are relevant to what you are doing right now. Everything else has been suppressed. Not because it isn't there, because the brain's function is to make you functional, and functioning requires not experiencing everything at once. This is not a controversial claim. This is neuroscience. The brain as filter, as the mechanism that reduces an overwhelming totality of potential experience down to a manageable stream, is not Bergson's invention. It is the description neuroscience itself uses for what the brain does. Bergson's move was to follow this description to its logical conclusion. If the brain is a filter, if its function is to reduce and select rather than to generate, then where is the thing being filtered? A filter does not create what passes through it. It shapes the passage. A coffee filter does not produce coffee. It determines what form the coffee takes as it moves from one state to another. A lens does not produce light. It focuses on what is already present. A reducing valve does not produce the water flowing through the pipe. It controls the pressure and volume of what was already there. In every case, the filter is downstream of the thing it is filtering. The thing being filtered exists independently of the filter, and the destruction of the filter does not destroy what was being filtered. It only ends the filtering. Bergson applied this logic to consciousness with complete seriousness. If the brain is a filter on consciousness, if its function is to reduce an overwhelming totality of awareness down to the narrow stream useful for physical survival, then consciousness is upstream of the brain. It exists prior to the brain's action on it. The brain does not generate it. The brain receives it, narrows it, focuses it, and presents a workable portion of it to the organism, navigating physical reality. Destroy the filter, and the filtering stops. But the thing being filtered does not stop. It was never inside the filter. It was always larger than the filter. The filter's destruction returns it to its unfiltered state, which is not absence. It is totality. This is the proof, stated simply. It is this: if the brain's observed function is filtration rather than production, then the brain's destruction cannot produce the cessation of consciousness. It can only produce the cessation of filtration. What was narrowed becomes wide. What was focused becomes total. The beam does not go out. The lens is removed, and the light, no longer focused into a single point, expands back into everything it was before the lens existed. You cannot destroy the light by breaking the lens. Now hold the proof against the evidence that seemed to support the production model. Anesthesia, the chemical that switches consciousness off. Under the filter model, anesthesia does not switch consciousness off. It disrupts the brain's ability to interface with consciousness, to receive, narrow, and present it. The organism loses access to its own awareness because the instrument of access has been chemically disabled. The awareness itself continues. The patient reports nothing because the instrument for reporting, the instrument for experiencing the physical world at all, has been taken offline. But the signal continues. The broadcast does not cease because the receiver has been temporarily disabled. The stroke patient who loses language, the Alzheimer's patient who loses recognition. These are not losses of consciousness. They are losses of the brain's capacity to filter specific aspects of consciousness into an accessible form. The filter is damaged. The selection mechanism fails in specific ways. What was accessible becomes inaccessible. But inaccessible is not the same as destroyed. The spontaneous memory recoveries Bergson documented were proof of exactly this. The memory was there. The access was not. When access was partially restored, the memory was found intact, waiting unchanged. Now consider the cases that the production model cannot explain at all. Terminal lucidity. The Alzheimer's patient who has not recognized their family in years, whose brain tissue is visibly and measurably destroyed, who has been absent from themselves for so long that their family has already begun grieving, who sits up in the final hours and is suddenly completely present, recognizes faces, holds conversations, remembers things that should, by any measure of brain damage, be long gone, and then dies. If the brain produces consciousness, and the brain is largely destroyed, this is impossible. There is no production model explanation. More brain damage should produce less consciousness, approaching zero as the brain approaches total failure. Under the filter model, terminal lucidity is not a miracle. It is a prediction. As the brain fails, the filter loosens. The tight, narrow beam of everyday consciousness begins to diffuse, and in that diffusion, in that loosening of the mechanism that kept awareness narrowed to the demands of physical survival, something temporarily expands. The signal comes through more completely, not less, because the instrument that was constraining it is no longer fully operational. The people who witness terminal lucidity almost always describe it the same way. Not diminished, clear, more present than they had been in years. Returned to themselves. Bergson would say, not returned, released. The filter was loosening. What had been narrowed was briefly, finally becoming wide. This is what the evidence shows when you look at it without the assumption you started with. The same evidence that everyone else was looking at. The same clinical data. The same neurological observations. The same correlations between brain states and mental states. Bergson did not have different evidence. He had a different question. Not, what does the brain produce? But, what does the brain do and what the brain does? Observed without the assumption of production is filter, select narrow, focus, reduce the total to a manageable, make the infinite practicable for a creature that needs to cross a street, and remember where it left its keys. The brain is not the source of your consciousness. It is the instrument through which your consciousness is made small enough to live in a body, and when the instrument is gone, the consciousness it was narrowing does not follow it into silence. It simply stops being small. Chapter 4. The Harvard Man Who Agreed. It is one thing for a French philosopher to build an argument. It is another thing entirely when the man who built American psychology reads that argument, sets it down, and says, "This is correct. This is what the evidence shows, and I will stake the remainder of my career on demonstrating it." William James was not a man given to easy agreement. He was constitutionally skeptical, professionally rigorous, and temperamentally allergic to conclusions that arrived before the evidence warranted them. He had spent 20 years building psychology into a legitimate science, extracting it from philosophy, grounding it in biology, insisting that the mind could be studied with the same empirical discipline applied to any other natural phenomenon. He was not looking for reasons to believe in the survival of consciousness. He was looking, as he always looked, for what the evidence actually showed. What the evidence showed disturbed him. James and Bergson knew each other. They corresponded. James had read the early work and recognized in Bergson a quality of mind he considered rare. The capacity to follow an argument past the point where it became uncomfortable without flinching and without cheating. When Matter and Memory appeared in 1896, James read it carefully. His response, in letters and later in print, was not qualified admiration. It was recognition. The kind of person feels when someone else has articulated something they had been circling for years without finding the precise language for it. In 1898, James delivered a lecture at Harvard. The title was Human Immortality, 2 Supposed Objections to the Doctrine. The audience expected a philosopher's exercise, an examination of arguments, a careful weighing of positions, the kind of performance that reaches no conclusion because conclusions are professionally inconvenient. That is not what they received. James took Bergson's filter argument, which he called the transmission theory, and applied it directly and without apology to the question of whether consciousness survives the death of the body. He was not hedging. He was not presenting the theory as one possibility among many. He was arguing that it was the most coherent account of the relationship between brain and mind available, that it was consistent with everything then known about neuroscience, and that if it was correct, the standard objection to survival. The brain stops, therefore you stop. was not an objection at all. It was a non sequitur, a conclusion that did not follow from the evidence because it was built on an assumption the evidence did not support. The assumption was production. The evidence supported transmission. James stated this at Harvard in 1898, and then he went further. He had been involved for years, quietly and with some professional embarrassment, with the Society for Psychical Research, an organization founded in London in 1882 to investigate empirically the phenomena that the dominant materialist paradigm could not explain. Telepathy, apparitions, mediumship, near-death accounts, the kinds of reports that serious scientists were supposed to dismiss without examination, because the paradigm had already determined they could not be real. James could not dismiss them, not because he was credulous, he was one of the least credulous men of his generation, but because he had looked at the evidence and found it more substantial than the dismissals. He had personally investigated a medium named Leonora Piper over a period of years, submitting her to conditions that eliminated fraud, testing the specificity and accuracy of information she produced about people she had never met, evaluating the results with the same rigor he applied to laboratory psychology. His conclusion, reached reluctantly and stated carefully, was that something was happening that the production model could not account for. He did not conclude that the afterlife was real. He concluded that the evidence for some form of consciousness operating beyond the brain was stronger than the evidence against it, and that the refusal of the scientific establishment to examine this evidence was not skepticism. It was the enforcement of a paradigm. It was the decision made in advance that certain conclusions were impermissible, and the consequent refusal to follow evidence toward them. James found this intellectually dishonest. He said so, repeatedly, in print. At some cost to his professional reputation, he spent the last decade of his life as president of the American branch of the Society for Psychical Research, investigating survival systematically, corresponding with researchers across Europe, building toward what he intended to be a comprehensive, empirical case. He died in 1910, before completing it. His final writings on the subject are those of a man who had followed the evidence as far as it would take him and found himself, despite every professional instinct toward caution, unable to conclude that consciousness ended at death. He did not find this comforting. He found it demanding. Because if it were true, it required taking seriously a set of questions that the entire intellectual culture of his time had agreed to set aside. It required admitting that the paradigm was wrong, not at the edges, but at the center. It required being willing to follow the evidence past the point where the evidence was welcome. This is what Bergson and James shared, not mysticism, not wishful thinking, not the desire for a particular conclusion, the willingness to ask what the brain is actually doing and to follow that question wherever it led, regardless of whether the destination was professionally convenient. And the destination, for both of them, was the same. The brain does not produce consciousness. It transmits it, filters it, focuses it, makes it available to an organism navigating a physical world. And when the brain stops, what it was transmitting does not stop. What it was filtering does not end. The receiver goes silent. The broadcast continues. Two men, one of the Nobel laureates in philosophy, one the founder of American psychology and the most credible scientific minds in the country, working from different directions, one from the logic of what filtration implies, one from the empirical investigation of what happens when consciousness appears to operate without a brain, arriving at the same place. Neither of them is taught in the standard curriculum anymore. It is worth asking why. Chapter 5. Why nobody talks about it. The easiest explanation is a conspiracy. Someone decided this was dangerous. Someone with power over what gets taught and what gets buried made a deliberate choice to remove Bergson and James from the conversation. There is a room somewhere, and in that room a decision was made, and that decision is why you have never heard this argument. This explanation is satisfying. It is also wrong, and it is worth getting it wrong correctly, because the real explanation is more interesting and more troubling than a conspiracy. A conspiracy can be exposed. What actually happened to Bergson and James is harder to undo because it was not done deliberately. It was done by the ordinary mechanics of how ideas live and die inside institutions. The mechanism is called paradigm enforcement. Thomas Kuhn described it in 1962 in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, though he was describing something that had been happening long before he named it. The dominant framework of any scientific era does not hold its position by defeating competing ideas. It holds its position by determining which questions are legitimate. Evidence that cannot be explained by the dominant framework is not refuted. It is classified as anomalous, set aside, and quietly not investigated. The framework continues. The anomalies accumulate in the margins where serious people do not look. Bergson's argument was never refuted. Read the philosophical literature of the early 20th century, and you will not find a sustained engagement with the filter thesis that dismantles it on logical grounds. You will find dismissals. You will find the argument characterized as vitalism, as mysticism, as the kind of thing a rigorous mind should not spend time on. You will find it placed in a category, pre-scientific, pre-modern, philosophical rather than empirical. That made engagement unnecessary. If the argument belongs to a superseded tradition, you do not need to answer it. You only need to move on. The movement that enabled this was logical positivism. In the 1920s and 1930s, a group of philosophers centered in Vienna. The Vienna Circle proposed that meaningful statements were only those that could be empirically verified or were true by definition. Everything else was not false. It was meaningless. Questions about consciousness, about subjective experience, about the nature of mind. These were reclassified, not as difficult questions, but as non-questions. Pseudo-problems generated by the misuse of language. Philosophy's job was not to answer them, but to dissolve them by showing they had never been real questions to begin with. This was enormously useful for a certain kind of intellectual tidiness. It was also a way of closing doors that Bergson and James had worked to open. If the question of whether consciousness survives death is not a meaningful empirical question, if it belongs to the category of things that cannot in principle be investigated, then James's decade of empirical investigation was not science. It was confusion, and Bergson's logical argument from the function of the brain was not philosophy. It was poetry dressed as reasoning. Neither characterization was accurate, but accuracy was not the point. Classification was the point. Once the argument had been placed outside the boundaries of legitimate inquiry, it did not need to be answered. It needed only to stay outside those boundaries. And institutions are very good at maintaining boundaries once they have been drawn. Then came the second mechanism. Neuroscience matured. In the latter half of the 20th century, brain imaging technology arrived and transformed the study of the mind. For the first time, you could watch a brain think. You could observe which regions activated during specific mental tasks, map the neural correlates of emotion and memory and decision, see in real time the physical substrate of mental life lighting up in response to experience. It was extraordinary. It was also, for the production model, apparently confirmatory. The brain lights up when you think. Therefore, the brain produces thought. The imaging seemed to make the case visually, viscerally, undeniably. You could see it happening. But Bergson's question remained unanswered beneath the images. The brain lighting up during thought is exactly what the filter model predicts. If the brain is the instrument through which consciousness interfaces with physical reality, then mental activity should produce measurable brain activity. The filter engaging with the signal would look, from the outside, identical to the filter producing the signal. The imaging cannot distinguish between the two. It shows correlation. It does not show a mechanism. It does not answer the question of what is actually happening, whether the brain is generating the experience or accessing it. The production model simply assumed the former and built on the assumption as though it were a demonstrated fact. Textbooks were written, curricula were established, an entire generation of neuroscientists was trained inside a framework that treated the hardest question, how physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all, as already answered. It was not answered. It had been assumed. David Chalmers named this the hard problem of consciousness in 1995, and the field reacted with the particular discomfort of people who have just been told that the foundation of their building has not been inspected. The hard problem is simply this: neuroscience can map every neural correlate of every mental state with perfect precision and still not explain why any of it feels like anything from the inside. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why are the lights on? The production model has no answer. It has descriptions of the mechanism and no account of experience. Bergson had identified this gap in 1896. He had not only identified it, he had proposed the only framework that dissolves it rather than merely restating it. If consciousness is primary, if it is what the brain is filtering rather than what the brain is producing, then there is no hard problem. The experience is not generated by the physical process. The physical process is the filter through which experience is made available to a particular organism at a particular moment. The question was never answered. It was outlasted, and outlasting an argument is not the same as defeating it. Bergson's proof did not become wrong because logical positivism found it inconvenient. James's evidence did not disappear because the paradigm reclassified it as inadmissible. The argument is exactly as strong today as it was in 1896. The evidence James gathered is exactly as anomalous today as it was in 1910. What changed is not the argument. What changed is the attention paid to it, which means recovering it requires only one thing: attention. Chapter 6. What modern neuroscience accidentally confirms. Science does not like to be told it has been asking the wrong question. It likes this even less when the person who told it so did so 130 years ago and has been largely ignored since. But the evidence that has accumulated in the decades since Bergson and James were quietly set aside has not been kind to the production model, not because researchers set out to vindicate a forgotten French philosopher, because they followed their data honestly, and the data kept arriving at places the dominant framework could not account for. 3 areas. Each one is anomalous under the production model. Each one is straightforward under the filter model. Taken together, they do not prove Bergson right. They do something almost more significant. They demonstrate that the question he was asking is not only legitimate but urgent, that the assumption the field is built on is not merely unproven but actively contradicted by its own findings. The first is terminal lucidity. The phenomenon has been observed by physicians for centuries and documented informally in the medical literature since at least the 19th century. A patient with severe and irreversible neurological damage, advanced Alzheimer's disease, brain tumors, prolonged vegetative states, who has shown no signs of coherent consciousness for months or years, suddenly becomes, in the hours or days before death, completely present. They recognize family members they had forgotten. They hold conversations with full syntactic and semantic coherence. They recall specific memories from decades earlier. They express themselves with emotional precision and personal specificity, and then they die. The cases are not rare. A 2009 review by German researchers documented dozens of cases in the medical literature and estimated the phenomenon was significantly underreported. A formal research initiative, the Terminal Lucidity Research Group, was established to investigate it systematically. The cases have been observed across neurological conditions, across age groups, across cultural contexts. They are not anecdotes. They are a documented, recurring cross-cultural medical phenomenon, and the production model has no explanation for them. This is not an overstatement. If consciousness is produced by brain tissue, and the brain tissue responsible for memory, language, and recognition has been visibly and measurably destroyed over years of progressive disease, then the sudden return of memory, language, and recognition in the final hours of life is impossible. There is no tissue to produce it. The mechanism is gone. Under the filter model, terminal lucidity is not impossible. It is predicted. The filter is failing. The mechanism that kept consciousness narrowed to the demands of physical survival is losing its grip. What had been suppressed becomes accessible. What had been excluded comes through. The brain is no longer able to do what it has always done, hold the totality at bay, and present only the manageable portion. And in that failure, something briefly expands. The person is not returning. They are being released from the constraints that had made them inaccessible to themselves. The families who witness terminal lucidity consistently describe the experience in the same terms. Not diminished, present, more themselves than they had been in years. One more conversation, one more recognition, one final moment of being fully there, and then the filter gives out entirely. The second area is near-death experience research. In 2001, The Lancet, one of the oldest and most respected medical journals in the world, published a prospective study by Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel and his colleagues. The study followed 344 cardiac arrest patients who had been successfully resuscitated. During cardiac arrest, the brain loses measurable electrical activity within seconds. By any available metric, the brain is offline. There is no blood flow, no oxygen, no neural firing. The production model's prediction is unambiguous: no brain activity, no conscious experience. 18% of the patients reported coherent, structured, detailed conscious experiences during the period of cardiac arrest, not vague impressions. Specific experiences: moving through darkness, encountering light, meeting deceased relatives, observing their own resuscitation from outside their bodies, some with verifiable details about events in the room that they could not have observed from their position and with eyes that were clinically closed. Van Lommel's conclusion, stated carefully in the Lancet, was that the current neurological models were insufficient to account for the data. He did not invoke Bergson, he invoked the data. The data were incompatible with the assumption that consciousness is produced by brain activity, because the brain activity had ceased and the consciousness had continued. The study was not ignored. It was debated vigorously, criticized methodologically, and subjected to the scrutiny appropriate for a finding that challenged a foundational assumption, and it survived the scrutiny. The methodological critiques were answered. The findings were replicated in subsequent studies. The Lancet paper remains one of the most cited studies in consciousness research. The production model's response, ultimately, was not refutation. It was the same move logical positivism had made 70 years earlier. The experiences were real, but they were products of a dying brain. Hallucinations generated by oxygen deprivation, by neural noise, by the final flickering of a system shutting down. This is possible. It is also an assumption. It assumes production in order to explain away evidence of transmission. It is the paradigm protecting itself by absorbing the anomaly rather than examining it. Bergson would have recognized the move immediately. The third area is the hard problem itself. In 1995, philosopher David Chalmers published a paper called Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness that did something the field had been carefully avoiding for decades. It stated plainly that neuroscience, for all its extraordinary progress in mapping the neural correlates of mental states, had produced no account whatsoever of why those neural correlates give rise to subjective experience. Why the firing of neurons in a particular pattern produces not just behavior, not just measurable output, but the felt quality of experience from the inside. Why is there something it is like to see red, to feel grief, to hear music? Why are the lights on? This is not a gap at the edges of what neuroscience knows. It is a gap at the center of what it is trying to explain. The production model claims to explain how the brain produces consciousness. Chalmers demonstrated that it explains nothing of the kind. It explains neural correlates. It does not explain experience. The most important thing about consciousness, that it is experienced, remains completely outside the reach of the model that claims to account for it. Chalmers called this the hard problem, because every other problem in neuroscience is, in principle, solvable by better mapping, better imaging, and better understanding of the mechanism. The hard problem is not solvable by more mechanisms, because the mechanism is precisely what it transcends. You can describe every physical process in the brain with perfect precision and still not explain why any of it feels like anything. Bergson had said this in 1896. He had not only said it, he had said why it could not be solved within the production framework, and he had proposed the only framework under which it dissolves. If consciousness is primary, if it is what the brain filters rather than what the brain generates, then there is no explanatory gap between neural process and subjective experience. The experience is not produced by the process. The process is the instrument through which experience is made locally available. The hard problem exists only if you assume production. Assume transmission, and the problem disappears. 3 findings: terminal lucidity, near-death experience research, and the hard problem of consciousness. Each one arrived at independently, by researchers with no particular investment in vindicating a philosopher who died in 1941. Each one is anomalous under the production model. Each one is consistent with a filter thesis Bergson built in 1896. Science has not confirmed Bergson. It has done something more precise than that. It has arrived from 3 different directions at exactly the place where the production model fails and left standing. In each case, exactly the question Bergson answered. The question the field still will not ask directly. What if the brain is not the source? Chapter 7. What you actually are. Everything up to this point has been an argument. A careful one, built from clinical data and logical inference, and the accumulated weight of evidence that the dominant framework cannot account for. The argument is sound. It has not been refuted. It has survived 130 years of being ignored, which is a different thing from being answered. But an argument, even a sound one, lives in the mind at a certain distance. You can follow it, agree with it, find it compelling, and still experience your life exactly as you did before. The argument sits in one place. Your experience of being alive sits in another, and the distance between them is where most philosophy stays. Interesting, perhaps important, but not quite touching the thing that actually needs touching. What needs touching now is this. If Bergson is right, not as a philosophical position you have chosen to adopt, but as a description of what is actually happening, then what you are is not what you have been living as. You have been living as a body that thinks, a biological system that, through some process not yet fully understood, generates the experience of being aware. Your consciousness, on this account, is something your brain does. It belongs to your brain the way digestion belongs to your stomach. It is yours in the sense that it is produced by your particular physical system, and it will end when that system ends, because it is what that system does, and systems that stop functioning stop doing what they do. This is not just a belief you hold intellectually. It is embedded in how you move through time. It is why the thought of death carries the particular weight it carries, not just the loss of experience, but the loss of the experiencer. The erasure of the one doing the experiencing. You specifically are ceasing. Not going somewhere. Ceasing. Now take Bergson seriously. Not as consolation, as description. What you are is not a body that generates consciousness. What you are is consciousness that is currently being filtered through a body. The body is not producing you. The body is the instrument through which the totality of what you are has been narrowed to a workable bandwidth. A particular perspective, a specific set of memories, a defined range of sensory experience, a singular point of view moving through time. The self you experience as you, the one reading these words, the one with your particular history and your particular concerns, and your particular way of moving through a room, is not the totality of what you are. It is the filtered version. The version the brain has made available for the purposes of navigating physical existence. The totality is larger. Sit with that for a moment without rushing past it. You have had experiences that suggested this. Not as mystical events necessarily, as ordinary moments that arrived without announcement and left before you could fully examine them. The state of deep creative absorption, where the sense of being a separate self doing something recedes, and what remains is simply the doing. Writers know this. Musicians know this. Anyone who has been fully inside a physical task, building something, moving through a landscape, cooking, caring for someone, knows the particular quality of a moment when the self steps back and something larger steps forward. Not dramatically, quietly. The boundary between you and what you are doing softens and then is not there. These moments are not aberrations. They are not the product of unusual neurological states, or the result of something going temporarily wrong with your brain. Under the filter model, they are moments of reduced filtering, moments when the mechanism that keeps the signal narrowed to a particular bandwidth loosens slightly, and something of the larger signal comes through. The experience feels like expansion because it is expansion. The beam is briefly, slightly becoming less narrow. The filter is momentarily less tight. You have also had the other kind of moment, the kind that arrives in grief, or in the presence of death, or in the particular silence of very late at night when the usual noise of the self quiets down. The kind where the sense of being a small, bounded, temporary thing becomes overwhelming, not because you have thought your way to it, but because it arrived. The awareness of finitude. The awareness that this, whatever this is going to end. The fear that attends that awareness is real and should not be dismissed. But it is also, under Bergson's framework, based on a misidentification. The thing that will end is the filter. The thing being filtered will not end. What you are afraid of losing is the particular configuration. This perspective, this point of view, this self, and that fear is not unreasonable. The configuration is real. The particular way consciousness has been narrowed through your specific biology, history, and experience is real, and it is genuinely yours, and its dissolution is a genuine loss. Bergson does not ask you to be indifferent to that. He asks you to be precise about what it is. It is the ending of a form, not the ending of what was taking form. The wave does not destroy the ocean when it breaks. Now consider what this means for how you are present to other people. Every person you have ever encountered is under this framework. The same thing you are, consciousness filtered through a particular instrument, a particular narrowing of something that, in its unfiltered state, is the same thing in all of them. The differences between people, in temperament, in belief, in the particularity of their experience, are differences in the filter. Different instruments produce different bandwidths, but the signal, prior to the filtering, is the same signal. This is not a sentiment. It is a logical consequence of the argument, and it changes the quality of attention available to you. When you encounter another person as a biological system that has generated a personality and a history and a set of opinions that may or may not align with yours, the encounter has a certain texture, transactional, at some level, even when it is warm. Two systems interfacing. The encounter is real, but it is bounded by the assumption that what you are encountering is essentially separate from what you are. When you encounter another person as consciousness filtered differently, as the same thing you are, made locally specific by a different instrument, the encounter has a different texture, not sentimental, not less clear-eyed about the real differences between people, but attended by a recognition that is harder to dismiss than any argument for it. The recognition that you are not meeting something fundamentally other, you are meeting a different narrowing of the same thing. Bergson spent his career approaching this from the outside, through logic, through the analysis of memory and perception and the function of the brain. In his final work, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, he turned to the mystics, not because he had abandoned rigor, but because he had followed rigor to the place where the mystics had always been. The direct encounter with consciousness prior to the filter, the experience, reported consistently across traditions, of the boundary between self and everything else dissolving. Not as a loss, but as a recognition. The self was never where you thought it was. It was never as small as it appeared through the filter. What you actually are is not a temporary arrangement of matter that briefly became aware of itself. What you actually are is awareness, passing through a temporary arrangement of matter, using it, as Bergson said, the way a musician uses an instrument to make something that exists prior to the instrument available in a form that can be heard. The instrument will stop. The music was never inside it. Chapter 8. The Proof Applied. How to live knowing this. Philosophy earns its keep at the point where it changes something, not where it produces an interesting position you can defend at a dinner table, not where it gives you a framework you can apply to other frameworks, where it reaches into the actual texture of your daily experience and alters it, where the argument stops being something you think about and becomes something you think from. Bergson's argument is capable of this, but it requires something from you in return, not belief. Belief is too easy and too unstable. It requires the willingness to take the argument seriously enough to follow it into the specific places in your life where it has consequences. To ask, in concrete terms, what changes if this is true? 3 things change, not as self-improvement prescriptions, as logical consequences of the proof. The first is the nature of your fear. Fear of death is real. It is one of the most fundamental features of conscious experience. The organism's awareness of its own finitude, the self's recognition that it will end. Nothing in Bergson dissolves this fear by arguing it away. But Bergson does something more useful than dissolving it. He changes its object. The fear you have been living with is the fear of erasure. The fear that you, specifically you, the one doing the experiencing, will cease, not go somewhere, not transform, cease. This fear has a particular quality. It is the fear of nothingness, of the lights going out permanently, and it operates underneath everything else, underneath the daily concerns and the longer ambitions and the relationships that give ordinary life its texture. It is the ground note, the fear that gives all other fears their ultimate seriousness. If Bergson is right, this specific fear, the fear of erasure, is based on a misidentification. What will end is the filter, the particular narrowing of consciousness that constitutes your identity, your perspective, your point of view. That is real, and its ending is a real ending. But it is not the ending of what was being filtered. It is the ending of the form. This does not eliminate fear, but it relocates it. You are no longer afraid of nothingness, because nothingness is not what the evidence points toward. You might be afraid of what an unfiltered state is like. You might be afraid of the dissolution of the particular self you have spent a lifetime constructing. These are honest fears, and they deserve honest attention, but they are different from the fear of erasure. They are fears about transformation, not extinction. And fears about transformation can be lived with differently than fears about extinction. Extinction closes. Transformation opens. Even when transformation is frightening, it contains within it the possibility of what comes next. The fear of erasure contains nothing. It is the fear of a door that opens onto a wall. Change the object of the fear, and you change what the fear allows you to do with it. The second consequence is the philosophical seriousness of the present moment. Bergson spent much of his career writing about time, not clock time, not the measurable intervals between events, but what he called duration, the lived experience of time passing. The felt quality of consciousness moving through experience. He argued that duration was the most fundamental feature of reality, not space, not matter, not the measurable and the quantifiable, but the irreducible flow of conscious experience, from one moment to the next. This argument is often treated as an interesting philosophical position. It is also a direct consequence of the filter thesis. If consciousness is primary, if it is what the brain is filtering rather than what the brain is producing, then your experience of being alive right now is not a side effect of physical processes. It is not an epiphenomenon, a byproduct, a kind of light thrown off by the real work of neurons firing. It is the central fact. It is what is actually happening. The physical processes are the instrument. The experience is the thing the instrument is making available. What this means, practically, is that the present moment is not a thin slice between a past that is gone and a future that has not arrived. It is where everything real is happening. It is where consciousness, what you actually are, is taking form. Right now, in the specific quality of attention you are bringing to these words, in the texture of your awareness at this moment. This is not where life is preparing to happen. This is where it is happening. Bergson called this living in duration rather than living in space, living in the actual flow of experience rather than in the abstract map of it. The map is useful, plans, memories, anticipations, but the map is not the territory. The territory is now, and now is where what you actually are is most fully present. The practical consequence is attention, not the kind of attention that is a technique, a mindfulness practice you perform for 20 minutes and then set aside. The kind of attention that follows from taking seriously the claim that consciousness is primary. If what you are is awareness filtering through a physical instrument, then the quality of that awareness at any given moment is not incidental to your life. It is your life. The rest, the plans and the achievements and the accumulation of outcomes, is the map. The awareness is the territory. Live in the territory. The third consequence is what other people become. This has already been touched on in the previous chapter, but it needs to be made concrete, because the abstract version, we are all the same consciousness filtered differently, is easy to hold as a position and difficult to actually inhabit. Here is what inhabiting it looks like. It looks like the moment when you are in a conversation with someone and you feel the familiar friction of encountering a mind that works differently from yours. Different assumptions, different conclusions, different ways of weighting what matters, and instead of the habitual response, which is to locate the difference as a problem to be resolved or a position to be countered, you pause at the difference itself. You become curious about it. Not because you have decided to be generous, but because you have remembered what you are dealing with. You are dealing with a different narrowing of the same thing you are. The difference is not an error. It is information. It is what consciousness looks like when it is filtered through a different instrument, a different history, a different biology, a different set of experiences that shaped the particular bandwidth available to this particular person. The disagreement between you is not a collision between two separate systems. It is two different filterings of something that, prior to the filtering, is the same. This does not mean all positions are equally valid. Filters can be damaged, instruments can be poorly tuned. Some narrowings of consciousness produce clearer access to reality than others, and the work of philosophy, of education, of honest conversation, is precisely the work of refining the instrument. But it means that the person across from you, regardless of how different their conclusions, how frustrating their assumptions, how foreign their way of being in the world, is not fundamentally other. They are differently filtered. And what is doing the filtering in both of you is the same thing. Encounter them from that recognition, and everything about the encounter changes. Not softened, clearer, the differences remain. The friction may remain, but underneath the friction, there is a recognition that does not require being stated to be operative. The recognition that you are not meeting a stranger, you are meeting yourself. Filtered differently. 3 consequences. Fear relocated from extinction to transformation. Attention restored to the present moment as the site of what is actually real. Other people recognized as different expressions of what you are. None of these requires belief. They require only the willingness to take the argument seriously enough to follow it into the places where it has consequences. To live, even provisionally, from the conclusion, rather than toward it. To ask not whether Bergson was right. The argument suggests he was. But what it means that he was right, and what that changes, and whether you are willing to let it change it. The proof has been made. The application is yours. Outro. The argument that was never refuted. In 1896, a man sat down and asked a question. Not a poetic question. Not a question born from grief or hope or the desire for comfort. A technical question, asked with the precision of someone trained to follow evidence wherever it leads, regardless of where that happens to be. The question was, what is the brain actually doing? He followed it carefully, through the clinical literature on memory, through the observed patterns of damage and recovery that did not fit the dominant model, through the logical implications of what filtration means, what it requires, what it excludes, what it leaves standing when you remove the assumption of production and look at the evidence without it. And he arrived at a conclusion. The brain does not produce consciousness. It filters it, narrows it, focuses the totality of what awareness is into the bandwidth, useful for a creature navigating physical existence. And because the brain is not the source, because it is the instrument and not the signal, its destruction does not destroy what was moving through it. The filter ends. The filtering ends. What was being filtered does not end, because it was never inside the filter to begin with. You cannot actually die, not as consolation, as a conclusion that follows from the evidence with the same logical necessity as any other conclusion that follows from evidence examined carefully and without the distortion of a prior commitment to a particular answer. Henry Bergson published this argument in 1896. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1927. Not for this argument, which the prize committee could not have been expected to honor, but for the prose in which all his arguments were made. He was the most widely read philosopher in the world in the early decades of the 20th century. Crowds lined the streets of New York when he arrived to lecture. Traffic stopped. William James read the argument in 1896 and called it the most important philosophical contribution of his generation. He took it to Harvard. He applied it to the question it most directly addressed, whether consciousness survives the death of the body, and concluded, after a decade of empirical investigation, that the evidence was more consistent with survival than with extinction. He said this in print, repeatedly, at professional cost. Neither of them is in the standard curriculum. Bergson's argument was not defeated. Logical positivism arrived and reclassified the question as illegitimate, not because it had been answered, but because the framework that was replacing his had no way to accommodate it and found reclassification more efficient than refutation. Neuroscience matured and built on the assumption of production without examining the assumption, because the tools available for examining neural correlates could not distinguish production from transmission, and the field did not pause long enough to notice. The argument sat where it had always sat. in the work, available to anyone who read carefully enough and followed the logic honestly enough, waiting with the particular patience of a proof that has never been touched, only avoided. And now, 130 years later, the evidence has arrived from three directions that Bergson could not have anticipated: terminal lucidity, near-death experience research, the hard problem of consciousness, and found the production model wanting in exactly the places where the filter model is strong, not proving Bergson right by external confirmation, demonstrating, from within the field that had set him aside, that the question he was asking is not only legitimate but unavoidable, that the assumption the field built on is not merely unproven, but actively contradicted by its own findings. The argument has not aged. What has aged is the willingness to ignore it. There is something worth sitting with at the end of this, not a practice, not a set of conclusions to carry forward, something simpler than that. You have just heard an argument that has existed for 130 years. It was made by one of the most precise philosophical minds of the 20th century, and confirmed by one of the most credible scientific minds of the same period. It has not been refuted. It has not been answered. It has been set aside by a field that found it inconvenient and outlasted by a paradigm that could not accommodate it. And you did not know it existed. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about how ideas live and die inside institutions, about how the boundaries of what is considered legitimate inquiry are drawn not by the quality of arguments, but by the momentum of frameworks, about how the most important questions can be reclassified as non-questions and left unanswered for a century, while the field moves on to questions it finds more tractable, and it is an observation about what follows from this. If this argument has been sitting here, sound and unrefuted, for 130 years, if the question of whether consciousness survives death has been answered, at least provisionally, at least to the standard of logical coherence that any serious argument deserves, then what else has been set aside? What other conclusions have been reclassified as illegitimate, not because they failed examination, but because the examination stopped? This is not a question about the paranormal or the mystical or the territory that serious people are supposed to leave to those who are not serious. This is a question about intellectual honesty, about whether the commitment to follow evidence wherever it leads is real, or whether it is real only until the evidence leads somewhere the paradigm has not approved. Bergson followed it. James followed it. They arrived at the same place from different directions and stated what they found with the clarity of people who have done the work and are not afraid of the conclusion. The conclusion is this: you are not a temporary accident of matter that briefly became aware of itself. You are awareness, passing through matter, using it the way light uses a lens, not produced by it, not contained within it, not ended by its breaking. The lens focuses you into a particular point of view, a specific self, a defined and bounded experience of being someone in particular, moving through time in a particular direction. That self is real. Its particularity is real. The specific narrowing of consciousness that constitutes you, your history, your perspective, your way of being in the world, is genuinely and irreducibly yours. And its ending, when the instrument through which it has been expressed finally stops, is a real ending. But it is the ending of a form, not the ending of what was taking form. The wave breaks. The ocean does not notice in the way we fear it will. What was the wave does not cease. It returns to what it always was before the wave existed. Part of something so much larger than the wave could contain that the wave, from inside itself, could not have imagined it. You have been living as the wave. Bergson's argument, sound unrefuted, 130 years old and waiting, is simply this: you are the ocean.